the show. I'm your host, Tini Cherie, here to you with a new video. Before we get started with today's show, I want to remind you, if you have not already added yourself to my Telegram channel, that's the best way to stay connected outside of YouTube. You can just click the link that's in the description and it will take you right there. It's very easy to download. In addition, if you wish to support this channel, you can do so two ways. You can do so through CashApp and also you can do so through Patreon. There I also post a weekly exclusive just for you. Last week I did a video where I spoke about who the people who inhabit Ethiopia were descended from. They were descended from the Sabians. And I think there was a lot of confusion inside of that video because many of us have adopted the European definition of what it means to be Semitic or Shemitic. Because of that, many of us cannot separate ourselves from this idea that people who are of Arabian descent are what is Semitic, and that East Africans, particularly people who originally inhabited the area of East Africa, could not be Shemitic. For that reason, I decided that we needed to spend some time talking about what is the difference between the biblical definition of Shemitic versus the European definition that we received. Most of you are probably very well accustomed to this map that I'm showing you on the screen. It shows Japheth being inside of Europe, Ham being inside of Africa, and Shem being inside of Arabia, or also some of the Asian area. Now, what you should know is that despite the fact that this is using biblical terms, despite the fact that Japheth, Shem, and Ham are originally the descendants of Noah, there is absolutely no scripture that verifies this as being the breakdown of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. None. The only scripture that we have that goes into description on the descendants of Noah is inside of Genesis 10. I'm going to read from the particular portion that talks about the descendants of Shem. Genesis 10:21 through 31. Also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. The sons of Shem were Elam, Ashur, Akashad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram were Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Akashad fathered Shelah, and Shelah fathered Eber. 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan fathered Almodad, Shelpheth, Hazarmaveth, Jerah, Hadoram, Uzel, Diklah, Obel, Abimiel, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, Jobab. All of these were the sons of Joktan. Now their settlement extended from Misha, going towards Sephar, the hill country of the east. These are the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, and according to their nations. This is the information really when it comes to who is the descendants of Shem. This is all we're given. We're given names. Some of these names we can draw semblances to. For example, Havilah. If you look at Havilah, that is a description inside of Genesis where it talks about the river of Havilah flowed out of Eden. From my research, and also many people have reached a conclusion that the land of Havilah would have been in Africa. Particularly, I said it would probably be southern Africa / Congo area. We're also given Sheba. We know Sheba comes from the Arabian Peninsula. We're given Ashur. Most people think Ashur is the Assyrians, but as I show, and I will show you again, Assur is actually a region that was inside of the west side of the Arabian Peninsula. So all of this is what we're given names. If you're not given a correct historical context of these names, then you will basically have to go by the official narrative. The official narrative of this is that all of these people were inside of the Arabian Peninsula. All of these people were inside of the place that we know as the Middle East. Is this true based on a biblical record, though? Well, we're going to show that this is not true based on the biblical record. But first, I want you to understand the European definition of what it means to be Shemitic. This is from myjewishlearning.com. I wanted to particularly pull from Jewish sources because of the fact that they are the ones who have set the agenda as far as understanding the Bible. And because of that, Christianity leans on Judaism when you're trying to understand things that are biblical, for better or for worse. So this is from My Jewish Learning. It says, as far back as 1704, the German philosopher and polymath Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, I probably mispronounced that, had identified a group of cognate languages which included Hebrew, Old Punic, Carthaginian, Chaldean, Syriac, and Ethiopic. To this group he gave the name Arabic, after its most widely used and widely spoken member. To call a group by the name of one of its members could easily give to confusion. and Leibniz nomenclature was not generally accepted. It was not until 1781 that this group was given the name, which it has retained ever since. In that year, August Ludwig Schlosser contributed an essay on this subject to the comprehensive German work on biblical and Oriental literature. According to Schlosser, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Euphrates and from Mesopotamia down to Arabia, as is known, only one language reigned. The Syrians, Babylonians, Hebrews, and Arabs were one people. Even the Phoenicians were Hamites, spoke this language, which I might call the Semitic. Schlosser goes on to discuss other languages of the area and tries to fit them, not very successfully, into the framework provided by Genesis 10. What this points to is already the agenda has been set for us. We've been told by many people that the original Yasharel, the Israel of the Bible, was located inside of Palestine. They have also said that the river Parath that we are told of in the Bible, they have had it translated to be the Euphrates. And also they have said that the river of Egypt is the Nile, which we know. So they have their territory stretching from the Nile River all the way to the Euphrates. And from there, people have come along, secular people who do not even believe the Bible, have come along to study the languages that are in the area, that the people who are Jewish have said that this is where we come from. From them studying the languages, they have reached a conclusion that these languages are similar, and these ones we will count as being the Semitic people. Now, this is important to emphasize because if you look at what the biblical definition of Shemitic would be, the Bible would say that it is a descendant of Shem. However, the way that the Europeans have used the word Semitic actually is not even an ethnic term. It is a language term. So if we're talking about descendants of Shem versus talking about languages that are in the Arabian Peninsula, that is two very different categories, and that should be emphasized. Now, I'm going to talk some more about this because I want you to really get the idea. Semitic, when the Europeans use it, they're talking about a language. By 1855, French scholar Ernest Renan, one of the pioneers of Semitic philology, wrote complaining, "We can now see what an unhappy idea Hirschhorn, which should be Schlosser, had when he gave the name of Semitic to the family of Syro-Arab languages. This name, which usage obliges us to retain, has been and will long remain the cause of a multitude of confusions." I repeat again that the name Semite here, Renan is referring to his pioneer study on Semitic philology, has only a purely conventional meaning. It designates the peoples who have spoken Hebrew, Syriac, Arabic, or some other neighboring dialect, and in no sense the people who are listed in the 10th chapter of Genesis as the descendants of Shem, who are at least half of them of Aryan origin. Renan was, of course, right in pointing to the dangers of taking the generations of the sons of Noah as a basis for philological classification. He might have gone further. The descendants of Ham, conventionally the ancestor of Africans, include, in addition to Egypt and Ethiopia, Canaanites and Phoenicians, who lived in the Syro-Palestinian area and spoke a language very similar to Hebrew. So again, everyone, this is my Jewish learning, and when you see very well, clearly spelled out, that Semite, the word Semite, has nothing to do with Genesis 10. This is all a classification based on language, not on ethnicity. So when I tell you that the Oromo were the real descendants of Shem, you can come around and say, no, they don't speak a Semitic language. Well, you're talking about a language classification. I'm talking about a biblical name that is attached to the descendants of Shem, who we know would be an ethnic group. Two very different things, and so this confusion must be put to an end. Now, they go further in defining race when it comes to the Semites. Let's talk about that. The confusion between race and language goes back a long way and was compounded by the rapidly changing content of the word race in European and later in American usage. Serious scholars have pointed out repeatedly and ineffectually that Semitic is a linguistic and cultural classification denoting certain languages and in some contexts the literatures and civilizations expressed in those languages. As a kind of shorthand, it was sometimes retained to designate the speakers of those languages. At one time, it might thus have a connotation of race. when the word itself was used to designate the national and cultural entities. It has nothing whatever to do with race in the anthropological sense that is now common usage. I'm going to say that again. It has nothing, the term Semitic used by Europeans or the commonly used term Semitic has nothing to do with race. In the anthropological sense, that is now common usage. A glance at the present day speakers of Arabic, Khartoum, and Aleppo, and from Mauritania to Mosul, or even of Hebrew speakers in the modern state of Israel, the state of Israel, will suffice to show the enormous diversity of racial types. So again, when they speak of this word Semitic, it's not a racial term when they are using it. We're going to go to another source because I just want to drive this point home that Semitic is a language classification, not an ethnic one. So this is from the Jewish Encyclopedia. They said in modern times, the highest criterion of kinship between nations and the possession of a common language or languages, which have a common derivation. This criterion is not infallible, but when checked by other tests, kinship in speech is most important evidence of kinship in race. When determined by this test, the catalog of Semitic nations differs somewhat from the biblical list. It includes North Arabians, South Arabians, the Abyssinians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Arameans, the Phoenicians, Canaanites, Hebrews, together with the kindred of the last named, the Moabites and the Edomites. The list in Genesis 10 classes the Phoenicians and the Canaanites with the Hamites, but the linguistic and historical evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of their kinship to Semites. So essentially, when you use the commonly used or European given understanding of Semitic, you are equating different groups who we know could not have both been descended from Shem. You're equating them as being the same people, notably the Canaanites and the Yasharites. So we spoke about the term Semitic as it is used inside of the secular, European, or commonly used sense. We're now going to talk about the biblical definition, the biblical meaning of Shemitic. As I gave you the descendants of Shem, it's important to know that there is a book that is not inside of the biblical canon that has been taken out by people who want to hide the truth. This book, which is absolutely upheld through history, an ancient Hebrew book as is attested by the Dead Sea Scrolls, is the Book of Jubilees, a book we speak about a lot on this channel. Now, I already did a video breaking down the Book of Jubilees, which kind of shows you many things are in Jubilees that are not in the Bible, and it kind of shows you that there's a book in the Bible that's missing, because when you talk, for example, about the Hebrew calendar, there's no Hebrew calendar given in the Bible. There's only pieces of the calendar, but the full calendar is not given in the Bible. How could this be missing? Well, it's not missing because Yah forgot to reveal this to someone. It's because it was taken out. That calendar is broken down in Jubilees. The true story of what happened in the Genesis 6 account of the sons of God, whenever they went and made it with the women, we only get one mention of it inside of Genesis 6. Well, the full story is inside of Enoch and inside of Jubilee. So there's a lot of books that you would not know that they exist, except for the fact that something is left out of the Bible, and we can only assume that it's been taken out by people who want to hide the truth. In Jubilees, again, an ancient Hebrew book found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, kept by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This book gives you the actual geographic layout of the territories of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So because I did a video on this already, I'm not going to go over this particular portion. I'm rather going to post the video I did previously right here. So it said, and there came forth on the writings as Shem's lot, the middle of the earth, which he should take as an inheritance for himself and for his sons, for the generations of eternity. From the middle of the mountain range of the Hijaz mountains, from the mouth of the water, from the river Kuwait, the ancient river, that's in parentheses from me, and his portion goes towards the west through the midst of this river, and it extends till it reaches the waters of the abysses, out of which this river goes and pours its waters into the Persian Gulf. And this river flows into the Arabian Sea, and all that is towards the north is Japheth, and all that is towards the south belongs to Shem. And it extends till it reaches the Sinai Peninsula. This is the bosom of the tongue which looks towards the south. I'm going to pause right here and say it's amazing. This literally matches the Sinai Peninsula. It's the tongue that looks downward. And its portion extends along the Great Sea, and it extends in a straight line till it reaches the west of the tongue which looks towards the south. For this sea is named the tongue of this sea is named the tongue of the Red Sea. And it turns from here towards the south, towards the mouth of the Great Sea, on the shores of its waters. And it extends to the west to Africa, and it extends till it reaches the waters of the river Nile, and to the south of the river, of the waters of the Nile, and to the banks of this river. And it extends towards the east till it reaches the Garden of Eden, to the south thereof, and to the east of the whole land of Eden, of the whole east. It turns to the east and proceeds till it reaches the east of the mountain named Hejaz, and it descends to the bank of the mouth of the river Kuwait. So I did this video about a year ago. There were just some small details that I would add to that video that I did. Since then, I've written the book, Conspiracy to Erase a Nation, where I've gotten to delve more into the research and the language and have a better understanding of what Jubilees is actually showing us. And so while for the most part that video was accurate, there's some small changes I'm going to show you. And these maps are available inside of my book, Conspiracy to Erase a Nation, available on Amazon. And also that you can go to my Telegram channel and you can have the free version of that book inside of the pinned comment at the top. But if you look at this map right here, you see this is the territory of Shem. Again, a little bit different than what I drew out inside of that video, just because if you see the northwestern part of the Arabian Peninsula was also included with Shem's territory, as well as the eastern part of Egypt as we know it today. And that goes all the way down through Aram, Arpachshad, and Eden, as is told by the Bible. This is around where Eden would have originally been. So this is the territory of Shem. And just for more context, this is the territory of Ham. As you see, we have Canaan, who was supposed to be a portion of the land that would have been on the Northwest African coast, but he obviously took the land that was supposed to be Arpachshad's. And also, you have Put, Mitzrayim, and Cush. So the thing that you should see inside of these maps is that the biblical definition of Shemite is not one that has adherence to the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, it's a lot of people who have been identified by the European common definition to be Hamite, because without any biblical context, without any biblical directives, actually, because there's no geographical map inside of the Bible that we have that's missing Jubilees. Without any of that, they have drawn their own maps as far as where Shem, where Ham, and where Japheth would have been. And of course, this is going to be one that goes with their narrative of how the world looked. The world did not look to them what it was. They want the world to look different, in that they want Africans to be separated from the Bible. And so this is their way to do so, to draw a line at Africa, say that after Africa, we're going to say that this is a new territory where only Shem's descendants would have inhabited. So again, that was a quick video. I hope that was helpful. The point of it, again, is to say, when someone says Semitic, they're talking about language. They're talking about a common language family that exists from the Arabian Peninsula. But if someone is talking about the actual descendants of Shem, this is not just the Arabian Peninsula. This is the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa. So correct anyone if they are confused about that. Make sure that you explain to them that there's a difference between what the common term that we see as Semitic being used, what that term is reflecting, versus what the actual Bible reflects. That's what we're concerned with. We're not concerned with what the scholars who created these words and their definitions, we're not concerned with what they say. We are concerned with what the Most High tells us about our history. So with that, I thank you all for watching, and Yah willing, I'll see you in the next one.
It seems to me that Jewish involvement then in that transatlantic slave trade precedes by many, many years, perhaps by 1,000 years, the actual beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. And let me explain. It seems to me that the most important theoretical underpinning for that transatlantic slave trade was what has come to be known in many quarters as the Hamitic myth. Some people call it the curse of Ham's story. When the slave trade developed, beginning in 1441 and for hundreds of years thereafter, people who prosecuted that trade looked around for intellectual justification, for rationalizations, for pretexts, if you will. And a variety of pretexts were advanced to justify the slave trade, to allow people to sleep well at night, for their consciences to be clear. One justification was that Africans were heathens. They weren't Christian, they were heathens, and therefore it was all right to enslave heathens. It would not be all right to enslave one's Christian brother, but it would be okay. It would be morally justifiable to enslave a heathen. That was one kind of rationale that was advanced to justify the slave trade. Another rationale was that Africans were less than human. Africans were devoid of reason, could not reason, were a subspecies of creature. They weren't human, and therefore again, whereas there might have been some moral opprobrium attached to enslaving one's fellow human beings, in the case of Africans, since they weren't quite human, that kind of treatment of Africans was okay. The authority for this idea was said to reside in the book of Genesis, in the story in the book of Genesis. Now, there's a story in the book of Genesis, and there's an interpretation of that story that allowed it to be used to justify African slavery, and they're two different things. The story in Genesis is in Genesis. It's been in the Bible ever since. But the sort of spin that was put on that story that enabled it to become the basis for the Hamitic myth actually comes out of the Talmud, the Jewish holy book, the Talmud. Somewhere around 500 AD or thereabouts, the Babylonian Talmud. Let me just describe the difference between the story as it appears in the Bible and the story as it was spun in the Talmud. According to the Bible, Noah, after the flood, apparently had a vineyard someplace, and he partook of the wine that was produced out of his vineyard. He got himself drunk one night, went into his tent, took his clothes off, as people often do when they get drunk. And according to the biblical story, he had three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham apparently entered the area where his father was lying in his drunken, naked stupor, and Ham, in an act of disrespect, gazed upon his father's nakedness, and apparently went back outside and informed his two other brothers of his father's condition. According to the biblical story, the two other brothers then came inside the tent or wherever, and out of respect for their father, they kind of backed into the tent. They would not look directly at him in his naked condition. They backed into the tent, they covered him with some kind of a garment, and according to the biblical story, when Noah revived, when he, arose from his drunken stupor and realized what had happened, he then cursed Ham's son Canaan and all of his descendants forever, and said that they would be the servants of the descendants of the other two brothers, Shem and Japheth. Somewhere along the line, I'm not quite sure how come, but somewhere along the line, somebody came up with the notion that Ham was the progenitor of the African race, and Shem was the progenitor of the Asian race, and Japheth was the progenitor of the European race. So Noah had three sons of three different races, and he cursed his African son and their descendants, and said that those descendants would be the slaves, the servants of the Asian branch of the family, and also the European branch of the family forever. And that's as far as the biblical story goes. The Talmud, which of course, my understanding of the Talmud, I'm no expert in the Talmud, but my understanding is that the Talmud consists of interpretations, what they call glosses, on various biblical stories. And these glosses or interpretations or spins are supposed to give people who subscribe to the Judaic religion a sort of an authoritative guide as to how to interpret the biblical stories and whatnot. So what the Talmud did then, the Talmud came along, the Babylonian Talmud, around about 500 or so AD, and proceeded to spin this biblical story for reasons that are unknown to me. But Ham, again, was said to be the progenitor of the African race. Now, interestingly enough, I've read someplace that early Christians also accepted this notion of Ham being some sort of progenitor of the African race. but apparently in the Christian tradition, the kind of, overtly racist implications of that fact didn't develop in the same way as it developed in the Judaic tradition. According to the Talmud, Ham was the original African, and when God, through Noah, cursed Ham and his son Canaan and all his descendants, he was in fact cursing the African race. Now, this was the unique new element to the story that the Talmud originated. That the curse on Ham and Canaan was not only a curse on an individual and his family, but it was a curse on a race. So here, this is the contribution then of the Talmud. That God, through Noah, cursed the African race. And the Talmud proceeded to embellish the story in the most delightful, should I say, ways. For example, the Talmud said that there was ample proof that God was in fact cursing the African race. It said, for example, that because Ham had gazed upon Noah's nakedness in the dark of night, that the African race was henceforth turned black, so that the blackness of the African became a sort of a visible indication of that curse. Now, these Jewish rabbis, the sages, they call them, wise men who put together this Talmud, they actually invented. I mean, they sort of elaborated on the biblical story. It's like a jazz musician who improvises. Well, they improvised on the story. They did a whole elaborate improvisation in the story, and somehow, Lord knows how come, but they came up with the notion that Ham, when he went into that tent and looked upon his naked father Noah, that Ham buggered his father. He had anal intercourse with his father. And because he had anal intercourse with his father, that's the reason, and here I'm citing Blackman, that's the reason why part of the curse was to give black men large sexual organs. So all of this was part of the curse. The black skin, the big eyes, even the kinky hair too, big sexual organs, all of this. So, as amazing as this may seem, this transpired 1,000 years before the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. And when the slave trade came into being, this notion of the Hamitic curse was revived, and it became, both for Jews and for Christians, it became the most pervasive of all the attempts to rationalize that slave trade. Let me quote the exact words of Harold Bachman, lest you suspect that I'm making this up. I'm quoting here from Harold Bachman, the dissertation I mentioned a minute ago, The Ebb and Flow of History. Quote, "There is no denying," this is on page 34 in case anybody who has the book feels like reading along with me. I know several of you have the book on it. This is on page 34 in the middle of the page. Second new paragraph. "There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source," and listen to how unequivocal he is here. It was the first, the very first. In other words, this is Bachman from the Simon Wiesenthal Center acknowledging that the Talmud was the place that invented the story of the Hamitic curse. "There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source to read a Negrophobic content into the episode." Here he is referring to the episode of Ham looking upon his father's nakedness. Ham is told by his outraged father that because you have abused me in the darkness of the night, your children shall be born black and ugly. This is in the Talmud. Because you have twisted your head to cause me embarrassment, they shall have kinky hair and red eyes. So if you ever wondered about the origin of the kinky hair and the red eyes of black folk, here you have it. Because your lips jested at my exposure, theirs shall swell. That's why black folks have thick lips. And because you neglected my nakedness, they, that is your children, the children of Ham and Canaan, they shall go naked with their shamefully elongated male members exposed for all to see. So there you have the origin of a whole variety of stereotypes pertaining to Africa. So the Hamitic myth then is where you really have to begin, in terms of a discussion of the Jewish role in the slave trade. They provided the rationale par excellence for the prosecution of that slave trade.